Welcome to In Focus with Aijaz Haider. Let's get to our top story tonight. Speaking to a virtual IISS conference in Manama, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said that the violence levels in Afghanistan are unacceptably high. His remarks came 2 days after the Taliban and Kabul's delegation reached an understanding on the rules of procedure for the intra-Afghan peace talks. The agreement had got stalled last week after a disagreement on some words in the preamble. But before we get to our discussion, let me state what has been reported with reference to Pompeo's remarks. So one of the facts, the intra-Afghan negotiations, was supposed to have begun on 10th March, which was consequent to the U.S.-Taliban accord for a U.S. troop withdrawal. But they were delayed by disputes, mainly over prisoner releases and the rules and procedure for the talks. And this was, of course, amid surging violence. Now, at the conference, Pompeo noted that he had met with the negotiating teams during a November 21 visit to Doha, and he said that he had told both sides that the strife must be reduced. And his exact words were, "I made clear to them that the violence levels can't continue while these negotiations go on and it won't work." He also said that we have asked all of them to stand back and indeed stand down in that respect. And finally, that the sides can begin to address some of the front-end issues, including a nationwide ceasefire. So let's get to our discussion now. Joined by David Sidney, who's a senior associate at CSIS in Washington, D.C. We also have with us Dr. Sameer Lalwani, senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Thank you to both panelists. David, if I begin with you. So let's go to that New York Times story, which essentially said that President Ashraf Ghani was trying to delay the process. Now, what exactly do you think he's hoping for from the next administration, considering that by the looks of it, the policy isn't exactly going to change from what it is currently?
Well, the decision about what the policy will be after the Biden administration comes into office has not been made yet. So I would not be in a position, and neither is anybody else, to say whether the policy will change or not. We can make our analysis, but the Vice President, President-elect Biden, will have the opportunity to change a lot of policies on January 20th, and he's already signaled he's going to change a number of important ones. Afghanistan is not going to be high on their priority list. I think that's clear. So decisions about Afghanistan will have to wait for more important things like the climate change agreement, relations with Iran, and a number of other areas. So again, I would stress no one can predict what the next administrations will be. Secondly, the next administration's policy will be. But secondly, they could be different. And that injects a lot of uncertainty into everyone's planning, both President Ghani's and the Taliban's, as well as, of course, Secretary Pompeo, who has, I think, 44 more days in office. So it's important to realize that when U.S. transitions happen, big policy changes do happen. Whether they will happen for Afghanistan or not, nobody knows. But so what's in the mind of President Ghani? Of course, only President Ghani knows. But every country around the world is working hard, trying to figure out what is the best way to advance their interest in this tumultuous period of a transition, the likes of which the United States has never seen before. So I'm going to be very cautious about predicting anything that might happen in the coming weeks, and certainly on January 20th and afterwards.
Right. Just a clarification, I was going to predict. I was basing it on some of the analyses and also some of what the President-elect Biden has been saying himself. But considering, and I agree with you, that he will be focusing quite a lot on internal issues also, including COVID. And then, of course, there's the environment, and there's Iran and China and the rest of it. And you said yourself that Afghanistan is not going to be very high on the priority list. So in the event that he decides on changing something, what exactly could that be? And I'm asking you on the basis of Afghanistan not being a high priority item on the agenda, at least immediately?
I think you need to look at what the key advisors that President-elect Biden has already chosen had said during the campaign. Colin Kahl, his former national security advisor, Tony Blinken, his designated Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, the designated national security advisor, have all been on the record over the past several months during the campaign and before as saying they could envision a continuing counterterrorism presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Well, that, of course, goes directly contrary to the statement in the agreement that Ambassador Khalilzad signed in Doha that said all U.S. troops would be out in April. So there's already on the record statement of somewhat differing policy, not a change back to the Obama era of 100,000 or 140,000 or whatever number of troops there might be, or even necessarily a reversal of the 2,500 that will be left behind if President Trump is able to complete his planned withdrawal, which, based upon some moves by the U.S. Congress, he might not be able to do. But those statements of a potential continuing counterterrorism presence in Afghanistan for the long term, in other words, after April, puts a very different picture on the agreement that the Taliban signed with the current administration. And it's something that people around the world have a hard time understanding. I'm not saying it's the right way, but that's the way the U.S. policy is. When administrations change, new administrations come in, policies change, and they change drastically. When President Trump came in, he did 180 degrees on a whole range of things that President Obama had done. And the same thing will happen with President Biden. And we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out for Afghanistan. But I think those statements about a continuing counterterrorism presence need to be taken very seriously.
Right. Samir Lalwani, David Sidney is making a very important point here. As a matter of fact, if we hark back to the time when President Obama was formulating the policy, then Vice President Joe Biden has been on record as focusing more on counterterrorism rather than the troop surge per se. So there is a likelihood that, and he knows Afghanistan very well. So there's a likelihood that could be one of the things. But then, as David has also pointed out, this is going to go contrary to the text of the agreement, what has been agreed on by the Taliban. So in the event that, President-elect Biden's team actually goes the counterterrorism way, and there is some contradiction with what the Taliban have agreed to, do you think that could be the end of the agreement, or do you think somehow the situation on the ground will change and the Taliban might try to fit in with that? It seems to me that it could create some uncertainty with reference to these talks and with reference to the earlier deal.
I think that's right. I think there is going to be uncertainty for a period of time. But I would suggest two possibilities. The first is that while it's right that the Afghanistan will be sort of a lower priority, probably on the back burner for this incoming administration that has to focus primarily domestically because of the state of the U.S. Healthcare system and the economy, by default, I think that leaves the Afghan peace process in place. I think sort of the status quo prevails for an extended period of time, and that is a deteriorating stalemate that's on the ground in Afghanistan and continued peace talks that I think are going to be challenged for a period of time. So I think by default, you're going to have essentially a continuing on the same path. I think there's a couple reasons why the Biden administration might sort of pursue that. First, they're coming in with an argument essentially that the U.S. holds to its commitments. And even if this was a bad commitment, I don't see the United States entirely ditching this process. I think they'll try to find wiggle room in the withdrawal timeline that was prescribed in the agreement with the Taliban. But I don't see them totally breaking out of this because it had set a bad precedent. I also think, though, that you're right, that the administration doesn't really want to focus. I think both you and David have said this, that the administration just doesn't have the capacity to focus on this at present. But I think in the long run, when you look at sort of the big challenges the United States is thinking about in terms of its foreign policy and the leadership team that's coming in with Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, presumptively Michelle Flournoy, they're trying to get out of this game of indefinite counterterrorism in the mainland of Asia. I think they ultimately recognize that the principal challenge is China. That is something that I think will carry over from this administration as well, and that we have to organize our priorities along those lines. Now, how do you square that with a deteriorating stalemate and a desire not to see the Afghan government fall? Well, I think the CT presence, there's wiggle room that UN could figure out. For example, the U.S. government could potentially figure out a deal with the Taliban, where the Taliban might want U.S. CT presence for countering ISIS in, for example, the Korangal Valley. There was a great report a few weeks ago about how the U.S. was effectively providing air support and close air support to the Taliban in the fall of 2019 in fights against ISIS. And they might want that again. And the U.S. was doing that without direct communications with the Taliban. They were simply monitoring their signals intelligence and then coordinating strikes to help suppress fire and enable Taliban offensives. You could imagine the United States offering sort of a de facto deal like that. It doesn't have to be with U.S. troop presence per se. It could be done through alternative mechanisms. But I think it's possible you could imagine that the Taliban will want their official U.S. withdrawal, but then sort of covertly or secretly in agreement with the U.S. for a continued CT presence that would ensure the equities of a number of stakeholders.
Right, that's a very interesting point. I'll come back to you, Samir, on that, but let me go back to David Sidney here. David, there's also the issue of the Afghan government's coffers. Now, we know that a high percentage of budgetary support comes from external funds. Now, with this getting lower priority from the U.S., that's also going to impact the U.S. allies that also contribute to these funds. So, how do you look at the flow of money coming into the Afghan government's coffers, and do you think over a period of time that is likely to suffer?
That's a matter that very much remains to be seen. In the Geneva conference that was just completed, the U.S. was very, I would say, ambivalent about its future without making any kind of really serious long-term commitments, which of course it couldn't because the current administration won't be around for the long term. I would expect that this will be something that will be on the foreign assistance agenda very quickly. And I think it's quite likely that in terms of civilian assistance, budget assistance, that there will be both a willingness to give more, but also a strong demand for accountability and clarity, real clarity that corruption is taken on and not enabled by the assistance. On the military side, the continued funding for the Afghan security forces, every sign that I've seen is that it has very strong bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, and I think there's no sign that would be decreased in the near term. In the longer term, of course, it depends on what happens on Afghanistan. So I think you divide it into two areas, civilian, military, and I think the military side is actually in pretty good shape given the lineup in the U.S. Congress right now.
And the military side, as you say, is likely to continue. Thank you so much, David S. Sidney, speaking with us. Samir, going back to the point that you were raising, now, in the event that these intra-Afghan talks proceed now that, they basically agreed on the rules of procedure, and also in the event that President Ashraf Ghani, as the New York Times story, frankly, more than implied, is not going to throw a spanner in the works, then it seems to me that there is a possibility that the Taliban, as you sort of hinted at, could actually welcome any counterterrorism support with reference to ISIS and certain other freelance groups that are operating on the Afghan soil.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think it's important that U.S. forces have coordinated with the Taliban. They also, 2 days ago, conducted an airstrike against Taliban offensives. So the U.S. is kind of in this Goldilocks dilemma where we're both trying to enable certain types of joint operations, military operations that are making the country safer, at the same time preventing Taliban offensives from taking over certain key districts or provincial capitals. And I think the U.S. is going to sort of be in that little in-between state for a while. They don't want to see a dramatic decline of the Afghan government's position or the military's position, but that we're sort of seeing the slow erosion of that. And I think that is the challenge over the next year, even as the Biden administration can't concentrate on this as a principal foreign policy engagement, figuring out a new equation, because right now the equilibrium is deteriorating, and it's going to be harder and harder for the Afghan government to salvage its position, both on the battlefield, but then in sort of the bargaining table, because their eroding their military position then undermines their bargaining position when it comes to the peace talks.
Right. One final question, Samir, quickly, again, referring to President Ashraf Ghani. Now you recall, and I think we've discussed this on this program before also, the whole idea of the talks proceeding to a stage where it's agreed, or at least the Taliban insist, that now for a final agreement, we need to have an interim government. Now, that interim government thing came up last year also. In fact, immediately after this year, immediately after the US-Taliban deal. And President Ashraf Ghani is on record as having completely disagreed with that. Is that something that you think could be a problem when the talks reach an advanced stage?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the Afghan government and Ghani is going to be opposed to that, right? I mean, the whole point is that will eviscerate whatever bargaining position they have. They control the trappings of the state, and that sort of formal identity, I think, is what gives them a lot of heft, and they're loath to give that up. I also think the United States is loath to press the Afghan government into that sort of interim government state. There was a big debate, I think, in Washington last fall about whether the election should go through. But once they did, and once they were seen to be, effective, I don't think the U.S. government is going to then sort of give up on whatever institutional processes have been developed in Afghanistan. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a sticking point for the Taliban going forward. But there's probably some sort of middle ground in between those two.
Absolutely. Thank you. So that was Dr. Samir Lalwani speaking with us. I'm also joined by Rahimullah Yousafzai, resident editor, The News in Peshawar. Mr. Yousafzai, thank you so much for your time. We're discussing, there's been finally an agreement. Last time we spoke on this program, there was this disagreement on the preamble, but you were optimistic that it could be worked out, and it has been worked out. So there has been that agreement. But at the same time, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has voiced concern at the IISS dialogue in Manama that the levels of violence are unacceptably high. So do you think that those levels of violence are now likely to come down, or do you think it's going to be jaw and war happening, simultaneously?
This is an old U.S. position. Pompeo or other people in the Trump administration will continue focusing on this as long as Trump is in power, because they have made a deal with Taliban, and they don't want to look weak or to admit that they made a wrong deal and there is still violence. But I think, number one, the violence is not only being carried out by Taliban. There are other groups like Daesh who keep claiming responsibility for the attacks. Secondly, in Taliban's case, yes, they have been launching more attacks. That is how they are putting pressure on the Americans, on the Afghan government. But some of the attacks, they don't claim responsibility, because in which, civilians are killed or whatever. And it looks that, in fact, those attacks also were carried out by Taliban. Now, the other issue is that, the U.S. cannot push the Taliban much. They cannot scrap the peace agreement they have signed. Because, they know that the Taliban has not yet made any ceasefire with the Afghan government. they're not attacking the American and NATO forces, they're attacking the Afghan forces, with whom they have no ceasefire. And with the Afghan government now, they will be holding these, peace talks. But, if the US had pushed the Afghan government further, and this rules of procedure agreement had been made earlier, not after, say, almost 3 months, the ceasefire could have been discussed earlier, and maybe there could have been a reduction in violence. So in a way, I feel that it's not only Taliban, the Afghan government also has carried out attacks. The Americans have launched drone strikes and air strikes, and Taliban also have carried out attacks. So all sides are responsible for the violence.
Right. Now, tell me, Yusufzai, President Ashraf Ghani obviously has to lose in the event of the talks reaching an advanced stage, and then the Taliban demanding that, well, okay, now for a final deal, we need to have an interim setup, which essentially means that the current power configuration is uprooted, and that is something which President Ashraf Ghani obviously does not like, and he's actually talked about it earlier and said that he's completely opposed to it. Is that some kind of a scenario that you would be expecting?
Yes, I think that's going to be a stumbling block. It's going to come in the talks. When, for example, the Taliban are now already demanding that the remaining prisoners should be released and that the names of their leaders should be removed from the UN Security Council blacklist. So these are the two demands they have made afresh, and I think they will, try to seek these concessions and return for reduction in violence. I don't think they will agree to a comprehensive ceasefire at this stage. So as we go along, new demands will come up. Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah both have said they are opposed to an interim government, because that means giving up power. And I don't think that they are yet ready to give up power. And I don't think they will even agree, say, after, 1 year or 2 years. Ashraf Ghani actually held those elections for president and even made a power-sharing deal with Abdullah after having refused it first, because he wanted to be known as an elected president leading a democratic government that will be dealing with Taliban. So it was with a purpose that he held the election. And I believe that, this will be a strong point in a way, because he keeps saying, my government is internationally recognized. The UN Security Council has termed it legitimate. So I think Taliban will never agree to that. And, there will be problems. That's why, after these initial discussions on reduction in violence, ceasefire, the new Taliban demands, constitutional amendment, Sharia, I think we are going to deal with this very difficult situation in which Taliban will demand an interim government and Ashraf Ghani will refuse, because without an interim government, I don't see the way forward.
Absolutely, because that's what the Taliban will say, well, we are now prepared to become part of the political stream, but for that you need to have a new setup. Thank you so much. That was Rahimullah Yousafzai speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss ongoing farmers' protests in India. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about the ongoing farmers' protests in India. Now, we did a story on this last Wednesday also, but it seems that the situation is getting worse. So this is essentially the farmers are protesting against 3 agricultural laws and have blockaded some key highways. On 29th November, farmers had rejected an offer by the Indian government to hold immediate talks if they ended the blockade of key highways. The farmers say the laws could cause the government to stop buying grain at guaranteed prices, which is like the minimum support price, and result in their exploitation by corporations that would buy their crops cheaply. The government says the legislation brings about much-needed reforms that will give farmers the freedom to market their produce and boost production through private investment. Talks haven't yielded any results, and now farmers have vowed to camp outside Delhi for months. They say they're ready to die and the government must withdraw the controversial laws. According to several reports, the protest sites on the Delhi border that popped up about a week ago have turned into semi-permanent camps. Tractor trolleys loaded with provisions show the protesters have come prepared for a long haul. Let's get right to our discussion. We're joined by Professor Arun Kumar, who's an economist, and Mr. Rajiv Desai, who's a writer and analyst. If I might begin with you, Professor Kumar, you were on the program last Wednesday also, and you had explained some of the issues. It seems that it is now becoming political also, and the talks are not going anywhere. And as I said in my opening, the protesters seem to have come for a long haul. How do you read the situation now?
And the positions have hardened on the side of the farmers. They now sense that they have the strength to be able to tell the government to withdraw the bills completely. The government on its part was apparently, softening its stand and saying, short of withdrawing the bills, we can, change various things. So there is a standoff at the moment, and that's why the last 5 rounds of talks, they have not yielded the results, and now the talks will take place on the 9th. But on the 8th, the farmers have declared a Bandh, and various political parties and other, trade unions and various other sections of the population have come out in support. So, the cultural entities like film stars, musicians, they have also come out in support. Truckers have come out in support of the farmers, because everybody feels that the farmers have not been getting their due, which is true. I mean, the largest amount of poverty is in the farming community, and especially among the small farmers. And as you know, that 86% of the farmers are actually small farmers cultivating less than 5 acres of land. And the average amount that they cultivate is only about 2 acres of land. So in a sense, these people are the real poor of the country. And I think there's a lot of sympathy, and especially because the government came down initially with a very tough measure, using lathis and using water cannons on the farmers. And that didn't go down well with anybody. So the movement has spread, and they are getting support from farmers from Maharashtra and various other parts of the country as well. So I think at this point of time, there is a standoff between the farmers and the government, and we don't know which way the wind will blow. The farmers are in no mood to retreat. They say they have come with supplies for 2 months. They can stay here for 2 months. And also, given the fact that they have planted their crops and there's nothing much to be done, they can stay. They're also getting support from the farmers back home who are saying that you stay there and we will take care of your crop. So all told, there is a standoff. We don't know which way the thing will go, because the government also, I think there are voices in the government which say that if we now relent and we withdraw the bills, then other sections of the population which are also protesting, they can also come down to Delhi and they can also demand their things. So in a sense, the government is sensing that, if it gives in at this point of time, then there could be other issues as well. And Mr. Modi has been projecting an image of a tough leader who, once he decides what he has to do, he doesn't back off. So that image would also get dented. So I think there are various factors that are weighing in with the government and with the farmers, but the farmers are drawing a lot of support all around.
Right. Those are very interesting points, Professor Kumar. Obviously, the situation has become politicized. But last time we spoke, you also talked about the economic business side of it and how agriculture works in India. And you mentioned just now, again, that 85% of the farmers are small farmers. Now, just a recap, and I remember you talking about this last week. What kind of guarantees or safeguards can the government give to the farmers, if at all, in order for them to, accept the fact that they won't get the short end of the stick?
So, the farmers are the poorest in the country because they don't get what price they deserve to get. The government wants to keep food prices down because otherwise it causes inflation, and then non-agriculture workers, they start demanding higher wages, and therefore there's an inflationary spiral that takes place. So the government has been announcing a minimum support price, which is what the farmers say less than what their cost of production is. They want full cost of production, and on that a 50% markup for getting some degree of profit on it. Now, as far as the small farmers are concerned, they actually borrow money from the traders and from the rich farmers and the landlords, who then advance their money, and in lieu of that, they get their crop at lower than the minimum support prices. So actually, very small percentage of the farmers really get the minimum support price, and bulk of the farmers do not get the minimum support price also. So I think what the government has to do is ensure credit for the small farmers, because that is what will enable the farmers to sell directly in the mandis rather than through traders and through middlemen who get most of the price of the farm produce, and the farmers don't get the profit that they deserve to get. So the credit availability has been the big issue. If credit is available, then I think it's possible that farmers would be able to get better prices. Also, we have to create a lot of non-farm employment. The problem is the farmers have nowhere to go, and as farms have subdivided, as families have grown, between various siblings, the size of the farms have declined. And that therefore makes it more difficult for these small farmers to really make a living for themselves. So I think the government needs to generate a lot of employment through creating rural infrastructure. Government needs to invest a lot of money in agriculture and also give credit to the farmers. If the government does that, I think some kind of solution can be found, to the problem.
Right. So from what you were saying, it seems to me, as an informed generalist, that this issue has lots of linkages. I mean, for instance, you talked about how the inflationary spiral will go up, how the non-agricultural labor would demand higher wages, how that's going to impact, for instance, in terms of competitiveness of Indian exports. And so it's a much bigger problem. Do you think that the three laws that the government plans to push through are the laws that actually take into account the broader picture, affiliated with this whole problem?
So the three laws are now actually there. They've been passed. The bills were passed. The laws are there. So the question is whether they'd be implemented or not, and they are not the solution to the problem, because as I said, what you need is massive generation of employment in rural areas in non-agriculture so that people can shift out of agriculture into other activities, and that requires investment in the rural areas. Now these bills, they are going to help the corporate sector, but not necessarily the small farmers. So the small farmers are going to be, dispossessed of land over a period of time. And what will happen then is that, without their non-farm employment, they'll have nowhere to go, and therefore they'll be in trouble. So what will happen over a period of time is that demand will be a problem. Demand has already been a problem, and that's why even before this pandemic came, the rate of growth of the economy was falling short, because disparities have been increasing, and unorganized sector has been getting hurt, and that's why the rate of growth of the economy has been falling. Now, if these bills are pushed through in the coming 3, 4, 5 years, it's not that it's going to happen right away, that people will be dispossessed of the land. It will take some years for this process to work itself out as the corporate sector goes further and further into agriculture. So over a period of time, you'll find that the problems will arise, and this will hurt the Indian economy over a period of time.
Right. Rajiv Desai, it's also now become political. As a matter of fact, there are now externalities. For instance, the Indian government is pretty angry with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who seems to have backed the protesters. There was a convoy of 20 vehicles in Canberra, the Australian capital, with signs saying we support Indian farmers and no farmers, no food. And there's also this issue of how the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi looks at the positions that he takes and the legislation that he pushes and doesn't really want to back off. So it seems like we are now looking at a stalemate here.
Well, first of all, I think that reforms are much needed in Indian agriculture. Yields are pitiably low. There's very little modernization, automation, whatever. And the government also has something called the Essential Commodities Act, by which it can commandeer farm products and so forth, like rice and grains, under emergency conditions. So these are the three at issue. But I think one of the problems that this government has always faced, and I think I made the point before, is a complete lack of trust. Citizens' trust in this government has been chipped away slowly but steadily, where very little exists anymore. Nobody even buys anything that the government sells because they all believe it's all propaganda and public relations. So, you don't. So then the real issue was to somehow build trust between the farmers and so forth. But instead, they drown them in water cannons and they beat them with sticks and they put barriers up to prevent their entry. So obviously it was a non-starter, and now it's gone to the point where there's a worry that there might be some really large-scale problems because of all these protests, and the farmers are simply saying that we were doing fine as it is, and many of the farming states are quite prosperous, like Punjab and Haryana. And so why meddle with this? Or better still, why not do this through the appointed agency, which is Parliament? Why not, introduce these bills in Parliament, debate them, have taken everybody's views, make changes, make amendments, whatever, and then do it. Not just come out and say, okay, this is done. It's like the same thing that was done at the time of the pandemic, and the government simply just 4 hours they announced a lockdown, and the poor people, especially the ones who work in the informal sector in the cities and the small towns, were caught unawares, and they were completely trapped. They had no income, nothing. So this tendency to act sort of imperiously and high-handedly and without warning, without consultation, I think this is what has eroded the trust.
Right. Now, that's an important point. And I also take the point that you've made with reference to low yields and, of course, the imperative to modernize. Now, Mr. Ashok Gulati, who, as you know, is an agriculture economist at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, he is saying, while accepting that, this modernization needs to take place, he's saying it'll take years before private investment comes in and creates supply chains that will better align producers with consumer demand. Also, earlier, Professor Kumar was saying that 85% of the farmers are small farmers. There's also the issue of course, land getting divided, within families. And they don't have access to credit. They also have very, very small profit margins. Some of them say that the minimum support price is actually lower than the cost of production. So there are a number of issues here. And it seems to me, from what you're telling me, that this has just been pushed through and not really been debated, not really, gotten the stakeholders to come in and speak their mind. And that is what has created the problem. So it's actually become a political problem rather than simply a problem related to modernization of agriculture. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, plus I would go further and say it's also become a diplomatic problem. The Canadian Prime Minister has stepped into the breach. So have the London police, by the way. They've been accused by the Indian diplomatic mission in London of not acting to prevent protesters gathering around the Indian High Commission there. So, instead of forget resolving it, forget containing it, they seem to be helpless. It's just expanding out of their control. Now, this is a point I've made several times on many programs that, this government doesn't seem to know what it's doing. It's losing control of everything. And then it'll take the high-handed steps, water cannons and bamboo sticks and jail and threats and so forth, and then turn loose their, now for example, they've turned loose their propaganda meisters to suggest a Khalistani link to this protest. Now this is all nonsense. Why can't they just sit down and discuss it? And the only reason I can come up with is that they don't understand it. And which is another point I've been making, that there are very few in this government who actually understand the issues of governance and the need for negotiations and the need for consultation and the need for deliberate action, not hasty, devil take the hindmost approach. So I think it is a problem, and it's not going to go away. It's going to, yesterday it was those people protesting Citizenship Act. Before that they were protesting demonetization. So this government seems to think that because they have incredible influence on the media, especially the large mainstream media, television and press, that as long as it's not in the papers, it's not happening. But it is happening, and now it's been picked up by international news organizations, whether television or media, not to mention the social media. So I have no idea how this is all going to come out, but I think that there is a case for modernization. There is a case to convince the farmers that this is in their own interest. But nobody trusts them.
Well, this was Mr. Rajiv Desai speaking with us. I'm now joined by Manpreet Singh, General Secretary, World Sikh Parliament. Mr. Singh, thank you for being on the program. We're discussing the farmers' protests in India, which is obviously now headed in a lockdown with the government. But interestingly, the Indian government is now saying that there is a Khalistani hand behind this. What would you say to that?
See, they are always in a habit to turn down things that come their way. Obviously, what they've done with the farmers is completely unacceptable. And we have to say at this stage that actually Prime Minister Modi has actually sold out his country to the corporate giants by taking and lifting the hoarding provisions, by taking the MSP away from the farmers that was given to them for the last 40, 50 years. This is one situation which they cannot handle, and as we know, India is always, always been adamant in blaming others for the sorrows that happens in this country. As far as the people are concerned, yes, I would say people are slowly moving towards the demand of self-determination in due course, and all the other sections of the communities are joining this struggle as well. Right now, the protest remains where people are saying that they need to take these laws back. But obviously, there is a growing, positivity about the self-determination of Punjab as well.
Right. As a matter of fact, it's become quite a diplomatic embarrassment for the Indian government, because the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has also stepped in and said, well, he supports the farmers. There was support in Canberra, the Australian capital. The Indian High Commission in London has also blamed the Met Police for not stopping protesters in front of the High Commission. So it seems that it's not just about the Khalistani supporting it, as the Indian government says. There are lots of people outside who are also supporting the fact that the actions taken by, the 3 agricultural laws that have been pushed without much debate, that those are things that the government needs to take back. But it seems that Mr. Modi's government is in has no intention of saying, well, let's have a dialogue and we're going to reframe these laws?
I think what you've said is just completely right. They are more in a habit of playing with people's life, whether it be the abrogation of Article 370 or passing the, Citizenship Amendment Act, or whether it be this farmers bill. I think they are more into the habit just to, make their corporate giants feel happy. They are putting people's future, people's life, and people's livelihood at stake. It is obviously an international embarrassment. Even in the UK, where we live, 36 MPs have actually written to their Foreign Office that this is completely unacceptable. Now, what they're saying is this is just Khalistani element. Yes, obviously, we who always have been, taking the positive side in the light of the international laws for self-determination. However, this is now, affecting, this farmers' bills are affecting each and every household in India. Now, we know in Punjab, there is about more than 70% of the people who are directly or indirectly dependent on farming, and these laws have taken away their fair share from them. So there is all sort of sections in India. They are involved in this protest, and it's not just now limited to Punjab. This thing is spreading like wildfire. People from farmers from Rajasthan, farmers from Madhya Pradesh, farmers from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they are joining these protests, and people are saying now there is a journal, a positive alignment to these protests by the film stars, by some of the Bollywood personalities,
Correct.
by common people. So this is not just confined to the self-determined list, I would say, but as people in general are moving to the cause to support the farmers.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Manpreet Singh, General Secretary, World Sikh Parliament, speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.